Ironic as it may seem, Pro Football's World Series takes place the first week of the 1950 season as the Cleveland Browns, champions of the All-American Conference, take on the defending kingpins of the NFL, the Philadelphia Eagles. 85,000 fans gets a thrill in the opening period as Cleveland's Don Phelps is long gone on a 70-yard scamper to the end zone.
The opening minute set the tone for a game in which the Browns, in a word, overwhelmed the complacent and unprepared Eagles. The vaunted Eagle defense proved no match for the Browns' aggressive passing game. Cleveland attacked with such lightning efficiency that its effect on the Eagles was akin to shell shock. The Browns rendered the Eagles into a trance-like state as ball carriers bounced off of dazed tacklers for big gains. In perhaps the greatest team debut in sports history, the Browns' rout of the world champions stunningly demonstrated they were not only worthy of the NFL, but they would be a giant of the league for years to come. Not bad for a Bush League team with a high school coach.
This was a great football team, and Paul Brown will go down in history as one of the great all-time NFL coaches. And the Cleveland Browns were for real, and we found this out.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey now, what's new? How's it going, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and once again, you have found Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. And we segue back into football, pro football. It's in the air. The Super Bowl is upon us, and we want to dial it back. We're going to go way back into the late 1940s, early 1950s, and in a crucial and very interesting time in the history of professional football. And this is around the time when the All-America Football Conference is giving the NFL a good kick in the butt. In the post-war years of the late 1940s, and a team in particular that dominated, and that's perhaps not even the strongest word to describe, the Cleveland Browns of the the All-America Football Conference from 1946 until 1949. And the clip that you just heard was their first ever season in the NFL, the National Football League. The team that was arguably looked upon as being somewhat questionable in the minds of the brain trust of the bigger and more established NFL in 1950 as it absorbed the remnants of the AAFC, and in particular the Cleveland Browns, who, as you may remember from some of our previous conversations, not only dominated the AAFC, but were kind of really worthy AAFC. They won every single of the four championships of that 4-year existence of that league. And despite multiple opportunities, or not even opportunities, but suggestions to challenge the NFL in various games during the existence of that league, never had the chance until Burt Bell, the then commissioner of the NFL in 1950, decided, hey, you know what? Let's sort of put this this competition thing, this rivalry thing, this challenge of anything from the old AAFC to rest. And let's just start our 1950 season, shall we, by putting the supposed best of the AAFC, the Cleveland Browns, against the world champion Philadelphia Eagles, shall we? Let's begin the season with this sort of a battle, and just let's see how good or how decent this challenger team from this no longer with us league is in the face of the dominance of the Eagles in the NFL. And oh boy, were both the Eagles and the National Football League surprised and put on notice by the Cleveland Browns. And that's the conversation that we're going to be centering on today with our guest, Andy Piascik. He, the author of a very interesting book called The Best Show in Football, the 1946 to 1955 Cleveland Browns. And in that, and in this conversation, you will hear a a very difficult to argue with logic and reasoning about this team, the Cleveland Browns, in its two sort of incarnations during this period of time. They being sort of one of the charter and dominant franchises of the All-America Football Conference, and then circa 1950 coming into the National Football League and kicking butt and taking names immediately upon its arrival, including the first championship game of the NFL in 1950 that they had a chance to win, which they did going away. And we get into all of that, but the discussion around the Cleveland Browns and their dynasty across these two leagues is the topic of conversation. And I think you're going to get some very interesting points of view from Andy, and rightly so, about the place in football's history where the Cleveland Browns, the original Cleveland Browns, shall we say, take in the pantheon of teams, people like Paul Brown, some of the great players like Lou Groza and Otto Graham and some of the others. This is a very interesting conversation and topic about not only the Cleveland Browns and their rightful place in NFL history, but also the broader history of pro football, the place of the All-America Football Conference in that history. And with all due respect, those years where the Cleveland Browns dominated that Challenger League and where it should fit, if at all, in the ongoing tableau and history of the National Football League. And it's still not without controversy, but we're going to get into all of that with our guest, Andy Piascik, in just a couple of seconds. It's a fascinating conversation. Andy is a wealth of information about this team, and you're going to hear and enjoy and learn from, I think, a lot of his observations. And we look forward to presenting that to you in just a couple of seconds' time. Let us pick one of our myriad of sponsors this week, and we want to call out one of the newer ones, and we urge you to take advantage of their wares and the little promotional goodness that we have for you. And it's Streaker Sports, streakersports.com. They are the purveyor of sports culture, and they are an amazing place to find great T-shirts and logo wear and all kinds of fascinating garb for you to wear, and especially to help remember some of these teams and leagues that we feature here on this little show every week. And one great way to sort of show your support for the show, as well as some of these teams that the time has, for whatever reason, forgotten, is to go to streakersports.com and take a look at all the great stuff that they've got. And pick the sport, baseball and basketball and football and hockey. I mean, you name it. Some amazing stories behind some great T-shirts and uniforms and all kinds of other garb. And make sure when you find something, it's not a question of if you're going to find something fun and cool, but when. And when you do at streakersports.com, make sure that you use the promo code GOODSEATS and make sure that you get 10% off all of your purchases by doing so. Again, that's streakersports.com, and make sure you use that promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Streaker Sports, the purveyor of sports culture. We thank them for joining our growing roster of sponsors, and we thank you for giving them a try and giving us a few shekels, a few little peanuts, if you will, for trying them out and hopefully making a purchase or two there at streakersports.com. All right, let's segue into what I found to be an amazingly rich conversation about the Cleveland Browns, both of the All-America Football Conference of the late 1940s and their dynastic continuation, shall we say, into the their early years of the NFL in the early 1950s. With our guest, a conversation with Andy Piascik coming up right now. We've had a number of interesting conversations over the last year and a half around things like the AAFC. We've touched on certainly the Cleveland Rams, but I don't think we've really kind of gotten into certainly the AAFC version of the Browns in particular, right? And that certainly fits within our genre very well. And you know, your book is a really good and probably seminal almost defense, frankly, of the Browns franchise during those AAFC years and those early NFL years, as arguably one of the, if not the best professional team perhaps of all time. And it's a very interesting topic and conversation that I'd like to have. But first, before we even get into any of that, give our audience a sense of how you stumbled into this story enough where you wanted to go deep and long into that defense.
I've been a writer of different kinds for a long time, and I grew up with an interest in sports. Football definitely was one of my favorites as a boy. And it so happened that my father, who was a youngish man in the 1940s, was a big Cleveland Browns fan and had media guides and books that I had access to as a young boy that I read and reread over and over again, along with any number of other sports books. And I was looking for a good topic for a sports book. Somebody had approached me about doing one, somebody who had read some articles that I had written. And that's what I decided to do. And it was simply a matter of getting together a lot of resource material. Any number of books have been written about the Browns at that point. There was also articles in publications that of an organization that I belong to called the Pro Football Researchers Association. And it was also a nice kind of task, and not all that difficult, actually, to track down some of the old-time players to do interviews with. So my original plan was just sort of to document the 10-year period, a really remarkable period, of the Browns from 1946 through the 1955 season. And then as I got into it more and sort of weighed, I guess, their achievements against teams of later vintage, especially the Packers of the 1960s, who are sort of held up as the holy grail of dynasties, it really looked to me like there was a good case to be made that the Browns were the best. And so that's basically what I ended up doing.
Well, so why, and this will probably frame a little bit of it, so why those 10 years in particular? I think I know the answer, but maybe helping to frame it for our audience, because those 10 years really are arguably kind of comprised of two sort of mini eras, if you will, of the Browns franchise, no?
Up to a point. There is a fair amount of continuity. There were two different leagues, obviously, and there were two different leagues that, for the 4-year period that the two leagues existed, were not playing each other. That 10-year period I picked because the Browns finished first place in their conference every year and played in their league championship game every year. That's 10 straight years. 6 straight years in the NFL after they joined the NFL in 1950. And whether you want to break it down to 6 title games or 10, depending on how people evaluate the All-America Football Conference, no other team has done that. No other team has even come close to the 6. We had the Buffalo Bills appear in 4 consecutive Super Bowls back in the early 90s. That's actually the next best number in terms of consecutive appearances. And now keep in mind, listeners who are perhaps younger, and because the NFL intentionally and consciously and over and over again tries to make it sound like football began with the Super Bowl, the first Super Bowl, I'm equating the NFL championship game that existed in the 30-something years before the Super Bowl with the Super Bowl. It was not a conference championship game. If you go back or if you look in your newspaper tomorrow after the results of the game today, you'll see something like NFC championship game results or AFC championship game results. In the column of the NFC championship games, you'll see the games involving the Browns from the 50s that we'll be talking about today. To me, I think that's a complete distortion of history, approaching a lie. The game that was played in the years prior to 1966 was equivalent to the Super Bowl. Now, we can get into little quibbles about, there were, for a period of time, 2 different leagues that existed in the early 60s, and that's true. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. But certainly for the period of the 1950s, when there was one football league, and whoever won it was considered to be, since the United States is really the home and the only place besides Canada where this kind of football was played at that time, the best football team in the world. It was not equivalent to whatever the winners of today's games are going to do, which is basically a semifinal game. So I mean, just that 10-year period of excellence in terms of playing for the title of their league, of finishing in first place in their conference every year, in addition to other things that we can get into, like their winning percentage during those 10 years and all kinds of other stuff. It really just does jump out at you if you allow the biases that have been developed over the course of decades to kind of try to put those off to the side. I'm sure we're going to get into a little bit of a discussion about the Patriots and their tremendous run over the last 17 or 18 years. And I hear it said almost as if it's an established fact with no possible discussion that the Patriots now are the greatest dynasty of all time, much as Belichick and Tom Brady are held up as the greatest of all time in their specific categories. I would say, that all three of those entities are in the discussion for the greatest in their different categories. But I think the idea that it's a closed case is ludicrous. And what jumps out at me is that these are statements that are often made by people who have no idea who Paul Brown was, who have no idea who Otto Graham was, who aren't even even vaguely familiar with what the Browns did in this 10-year run that we're talking about. So I know that's the nature of sports talk. It doesn't matter what you know or what the facts are. If you say it loud enough and you're visible enough, then it becomes almost a truism. I think, for the serious football fan, for the serious sports fan, they really want to kind of get into, what are the facts? And that's sort of what I attempted to try to do with the book.
Well, and this is a little bit of why we kind of, I think I've evolved into this show, is to sort of go back a bit into teams and leagues and situations that, for whatever reason, history has either sort of forgotten, maybe on purpose and for good reason, but frankly, or maybe it's just steamrolled or smoothed over, shall we say, right? So we've had many conversations and sort of questions, frankly, around sort of modern versions of sports and leagues that exist today, and I guess the general bucket I could put it in is sort of selective memory, right? When it's convenient and or potentially profit-inducing or protective, the sort of reminiscences and or fuzzy embrace of the past. But in times and situations where current lever pullers, shall we say, or owners of such, may not want to remember certain things or potential side tracking or frankly just abject failures, challenger leagues and then some. And it's a very valid point. And with the Browns, right? I don't think anybody even of a certain age sort of doesn't revere and or understand sort of the contributions of folks like Paul Brown and that team. But it's a very compelling point, right? Because there is sort of that that weight tip towards today and current social media and sort of the feeling that because we're talking about it now in modern times that what came before matters less and or it does not have as much weight as what happened in the past.
I think that's absolutely true. I think it's interesting to compare pro football with baseball, for example. Baseball historically has done a much different approach, a much better job, I would put it, of embracing its past, of propagating its past, of trying to popularizing its past. I think some of that has dwindled as we've kind of got into this hyper social media age, as you mentioned. But it's understood that when you talk about the greatest baseball players of all time, that people like Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth and Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio are in the discussion, even though none of those people has played for almost about 60 years. You would probably be hard-pressed to find any player, aside from Jim Brown, from, I don't know, the 1960s and earlier who would even be included in most such discussions. I mean, I make the mistake once in a while of tuning into the NFL Network when they're doing these 10 best whatever shows, 10 best games, 10 best players, 10 best quarterbacks, whatever it might be. It's a bad habit I'm trying to break because they're just so idiotic often that.
Well, it's television. It's television clickbait, right? I mean, you can always make more of those, and the instant debate that comes with those as you make those selections, right?
Yeah, but I think, I mean, sure, that's part of it, but it's also just the fact that it's a network that's run by the NFL is really a disgrace because it's not just people getting on there babbling who maybe we can agree aren't all that qualified to talk about 100 years worth of history. It's the fact that people who were recognized clearly at their time as the best of their era, or even for a period of time afterwards as the best ever, or in the conversation of the best ever, have dramatically dropped completely out of the picture and without really any kind of explanation or exploration of, well, why would that be true? Why would a guy, and I'm talking about Otto Graham now, who won more championships, more most valuable player awards, was all-pro, first-team all-pro more times than any other quarterback in the history of football. How could it be possible that somebody like that could not make the list of the 10 best quarterbacks of all time on one of these stupid shows? What's the information that you're using to? So is winning less championships and being MVP less times and all-pro less times and winning fewer passing titles, is that better? And don't believe me, I'm not thinking in any way, shape, or form that the book that I wrote or any conversations that I have are going to have any dent on any of this, because I know that's not the case. But I would hope at minimum that there are thoughtful fans who are open and who base what they do or conclude or think on evidence and facts would take away a little bit of it for themselves, that it's a little bit of a different picture than what the popular media sort of presents.
Well, it's also, too, frankly, let's get into the Browns specifically here. This is also sort of a continuation kind of story, right? So regardless of where, as an historian, one would sort of put today's Cleveland Browns and, are really the heritage of the old Browns, really with the Baltimore Ravens and all the sort of machinations of team movements and where those histories officially lie and reside. The reality is that, I think, those who, what's the sort of proverbial phrase, right? Those who sort of ignore history are doomed to repeat it. And it's sort of not necessarily an admonition, but really, do you ever wonder as a modern day fan, as you're making your sports bets or your fantasy league roster selections, right? Where these things called the Browns came from, like how the name come about, like the team just like automatically just had been there ever since time began. No, of course not, right? But that to me is kind of like part of all that. But let me throw out a very layman's, right? And you're obviously the more of the expert on this topic, hence the conversation. But let me sort of throw out a layman's sort of theory here. Maybe as around, say, the Browns, right? Is the the questioning perhaps, or why it's even a debate about how good relative to other teams over the course of professional football history the Browns were? Do you think that they through the lens of historical memory and debate falter a bit because they had the I guess the issue of having been part of a challenger league to the NFL, the AAFC, and the debate over whether the AAFC is or was, quote unquote, top tier professional football and or should be remembered and or incorporated in the NFL records?
I would say the answer is yes to all those things. Yes. To a large extent, despite the greatness of the Browns in the 6-year period of the NFL portion of this dynasty, what you laid out is a big question mark that lingers over the whole thing. and I would say is maybe the main reason why some people would dismiss them as the greatest dynasty. And, that's understandable. I think in some ways there is some information out there, including some books about the All-America Football Conference that people can dive into if they're interested enough. And even just reading portions of my book where I try to evaluate it. It's not simply just, documenting, well, this is what happened, this is how it started, and this is why it ended or how it ended or all that. I really wanted to try to figure out, is there any kind of way that you can evaluate the relative strengths of the two leagues, considering that they never once played a single game against each other? And then the other factor that I think really weighs heavily in the Browns' favor is what they did after they came into the NFL. I mean, it's literally unprecedented. No other team in the history of the four major professional sports has ever come into an already existing league and won the championship of that league in their very first season. Never. Nobody. Ever. So, obviously it wasn't a fluke, because for 5 more years, the team finished in first place, often in dominating fashion, in the Eastern Conference of the National Football League, this, supposedly vastly superior league to the All-America Conference. There were people, and not just partisans. I mean, clearly there was a reason why owners of the Washington Redskins and other teams in the NFL were compelled to denigrate the Browns at the time of the merger and talk about how now they were going to really be playing against serious competition and that they would be lucky if they were a 500 team, and odds were that they would be something worse. But, clearly what they did was exactly the opposite of what a lot of the anti-Brown sentiment was at the time. Came in, won the championship, and then played at basically the highest level for an additional 5 seasons after that, without any kind of significant roster turnover, arguably possibly being a little bit weaker than they had been a year or two before that in the late years of the All-America Football Conference, because of players who retired and that weren't replaced by players who were as good. And I lay some of that out in the book as to specific personnel discussions. But yeah, so I think definitely circling back to what you originally said, yes, I think not only are most modern fans likely to be completely unfamiliar with the All-America Football Conference, those that are going to basically be looking at it through a prism that I think is somewhat distorted. But I think the natural reaction of people who, whether they've heard about it or not, or know much of anything about it, is just to be dismissive of the possibility that the two leagues could have been at this on a similar level, which is basically the conclusion that I come to.
Well, let's talk about the AAFC, right? Because it is. We've had a few conversations about it, and certainly a lot more depth and investigation, I think, to go. But I'm really curious as to sort of the foundings of the Browns as a member of that competitive league, right? So you're coming out of the end of the Great World War II. You have pro football, which has sort of still at that point never really been sort of top tier, say, relative to the college game or even baseball. And all of a sudden, right, you've got some very deep-pocketed investors, right, arguably even more well-off collectively than, say, those of the legacy NFL owners, right, who, held fort and kept things going even in the darkest days and depletion of squads and whatnot from the war. Maybe you can give our audience a sense, sort of in general terms, sort of how the Browns franchise sort of came to be in the midst of this new league, especially given that the Cleveland Rams were such a relatively stable force themselves in the NFL at that time.
Yes, it certainly was sort of an odd time for somebody to come up with the idea of starting a new football league, because it actually goes back to 1944 when the war was still being very much waged. It was the brainchild of a sports writer from the Chicago Tribune by the name of Arch Ward. He was probably maybe the most famous sports writer in the country. He had had two successful ventures up to that point, highly successful actually, in that he was the initiator of the baseball All-Star game, which originally was planned as a one-shot affair in 1933 in Chicago, where he was based at Comiskey Park, and proved to be so successful that it continues to be played every year up until today. He also initiated the college All-Star game, which was a football game also played in Chicago at Soldier Field every summer between the defending NFL champion and a collection of the best recently graduated college players. So he had a definite track record, and he had a platform, and when he said things and made known that he was going to be doing something, people paid attention. And so it was actually odd in the sense that he was doing this in the middle of the war at a time when NFL teams were suspending play for a season or time, and a couple occasions, I guess, combining themselves into one entity, two teams playing as one entity for a short period of time, just simply because of costs, and also, as you mentioned, because any number of players were not available because they were in the service. The wise decision that they ended up making once Arch Ward began to get the investors on board that you mentioned was that they would wait until the summer of 1946 before they would begin operations playing. They began signing players and putting together staff and building all the stuff that needs to be done to create a football team right from the beginning. But clearly it would have been a much more treacherous road had they decided to play, say, in 1945 than in 1946. And the other thing I'll say before I get to the specifics of the Browns is that on the plus side, it was kind of a unique situation because you had this pool of players who were, as they began coming back from the service, were available to be signed, who otherwise would have been either signed already by NFL teams or who would have been going back to college. So, for example, you had players all through that time, the 43, 44, 45, who were being drafted, whether they had actually completed their college eligibility or not, and were then technically the property of the NFL team that drafted them. But there was basically no time when they were being drafted into the military shortly after while they were still playing or immediately after graduating college. So there was no time to be haggling over, signing a contract. They were being sent over to do something much more serious. So as we get to 45 and 46, when the All-America Conference teams are beginning to sign players, lots of these players, in addition to those who continue to come out of college, are now a sort of unofficial free agent pool that can be signed because they have not signed contracts. And even in some cases where they had already signed contracts, the new contracts were offered and players just simply disregarded the previous contracts that they had signed. And then also, and like I said, some of these players never even went back to college to finish what eligibility they had left. Lou Groza is a perfect example. Lou Groza was a freshman at Ohio State when Paul Brown was the coach of Ohio State. He had been recruited. He was from Southern Ohio. He's a well-known athlete as a high schooler in Ohio. Went into the service after his freshman season for 3 years, I guess it was, never returned to Ohio State to play football. But Paul Brown had seen enough of him as a high schooler and as a freshman to sign him to a pro contract in 1946, at which point Groza was 22 years old and his college class had technically graduated. And so this kind of thing, while not common, did make up a fairly substantial pool of players for both leagues. Dante Lavelli is another one. Played 1 year of varsity football at Ohio State for Paul Brown and did the same thing that Groza did. And there are others. I mentioned those two because those are both players who went on to be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame and are, the most visible, but there were others. So anyway, one of the people who was in contact with Arch Ford was a guy named Arthur McBride, who was based in Cleveland, was a businessman, big football fan, and he decided to invest whatever the amount was, which I don't have at my fingertips. It would not be anything comparable, even adjusted to what a franchise would go for years later. But it was a significant investment, and it was definitely a risky proposition, which people knew at the time. And it basically took off from there. McBride eventually it was recommended to him that Paul Brown was a rising, youngish coach who he should consider hiring, which he did. And, Paul Brown had tremendous success both at high school and in a short period of time at Ohio State. So basically, Paul Brown, very meticulous guy, very organized, very knowledgeable both about what he wanted to do in terms of how to play football, but also in terms of how he wanted to build a team. And he, more so, I think, than now, where you have the rise of football in places like Florida and Texas and Southern California, that whole area around the Great Lakes was the ground zero for football. So not only in terms of talent, but in terms of interest. So Paul Brown was exposed to all the great college players of the Big Ten, of the smaller schools within Ohio, like Miami of Ohio, Toledo, all these places where he ended up signing players who ended up having very good pro careers. He was in on it and had an up-close look at all those players, much more so than probably anybody else even in the NFL. So the big question, there's a lot, I can go on and on about this. The big question confronting the Cleveland franchise is exactly the one that you mentioned, which is that McBride went in investing knowing that there was an established team in the NFL that actually went on to win the NFL championship in 1945. So the expectation was that it was going to be a head-to-head competition in Cleveland, and it's a good chance that there would be a lot of money lost before anybody was going to be able to be making any profits.
All right, time for me to catch my breath, get a cool, tasty beverage, and remind you, while we do so, that our friends at Audible are here to remind you that you can get a free audiobook download of your choice from over 180,000 titles. If you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and use that link, of course, to try for yourself a free audiobook on us, gratis, if you will. And you will love the idea of audiobooks. It's an awesome way to kill time and occupy and stimulate your mind, perhaps when your eyes are busy doing something else. And of course, there are plenty of interesting books to be found, especially in the world of sports and sports history. And I think our audience might enjoy a few of these, of course, including the seminal work by baseball legend Jim Bouton. It's called Ball 4. It is not only written, but it's also narrated by him. You could use your free credit for that book. And of course, as you know, Ball 4 centers around the 1969 one-year wonder that is the Seattle Pilots of Major League Baseball, but obviously the background for a whole lot of other observations about the sport of baseball. And it remains to this day perhaps one of the most celebrated writings about the sport of baseball in this country. Of course, you can also, if you're not a big baseball fan, you can go into the world of soccer with the autobiography called My Turn by Johan Cruyff, the late Johan Cruyff, perhaps one of the world's best ever soccer players. He of Dutch heritage, of course. Plenty of great legendary years at club play as well as national team play. for the Dutch team, as well as, for our audience, maybe a little bit of interest, his journeys in the North American Soccer League in the late 70s and early 80s with the Washington Diplomats and the Los Angeles Aztecs. And of course, if you're into football, there's probably no better book, especially if you find yourself really interested in the sort of deep and rich history of the NFL, with the book called NFL Football, A History of America's New National Pastime. It is written by Richard Crepeau and narrated by Marlon May. That, too, is an audiobook that you could choose from over, like I said, 180,000 titles. There's got to be something in there that's going to be of interest to you. And by all means, give it a try. And we appreciate your doing so at audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you're going to get your free audiobook download. You can cancel it anytime. And again, even if you cancel it, you can keep that book as long as your device exists. So again, we appreciate it. Give it a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. So the original, and I think we've also the original thought was that there were going to be two teams in Cleveland battling it out.
Yeah, and Arch Ward, at least from what it sounds, I don't know how much he sincerely believed this, but he apparently had the idea that he was going to be able to, he and the owners were going to be able to convince the NFL that it could be more of a setup like what existed between the American League and the National League in baseball. That once the NFL saw that this was a serious venture, that they would be sort of welcomed as unfriendly competitors, but all under one monopolistic umbrella, and operate without rating, without competing for contracts, which of course would drive salaries up. And as you mentioned, the NFL at this point was only at 25 years old, and there had been a lot of financial setbacks. Many franchises had fallen by the boards. People were basically not really well-heeled. I mean, a guy like George Halas had been an NFL player himself and ended up being in part of the ownership group over time. Other people were sort of off in side kind of businesses like the Rooney family and Mara. The one guy who was probably the wealthiest by far, and he was quite wealthy, was the guy who owned the Rams. His name was Dan Reeves, not to be confused with the guy who later played for the Cowboys and was a coach for many years. But he owned some kind of supermarket monopoly and was a bona fide millionaire at a time when that was really a lot of money. But, so the original plan, and everybody knew it from the outset, I don't really know how this would square with the whole idea of getting along peacefully, but the plan, yes, was that they were placing a franchise in Cleveland with the expectations that they were going to be going head-to-head with the Rams. And then apparently because, he saw greener pastures and was willing to take the chance, Dan Reeves almost immediately after the 1945 season decided to move the franchise to Los Angeles, which didn't get him away from the All-America Conference, because the All-America Conference had already established a team that they were going to have playing in Los Angeles too. But I think, part of it was that Reeves saw that there was the potential for more money to be made there. But frankly, I think he also, once Paul Brown became kind of the guy who was running the Browns franchise, that was a daunting challenge that maybe I think Reeves was not up to having his team face, because Brown's roots were in Ohio. He had been a highly successful high school football coach for 12 years or so, were winning multiple state championships. Coached only for 3 years at Ohio State, but won a national championship in his second season, and obviously had all kinds of connections with high school coaches, knew everything that there probably was to know about high school players and college players, and not just the state of Ohio, but throughout the region. And just to sidetrack for 1 second, when I interviewed Ara Parsegian, he told me a story that I found hard to believe, and then I rechecked it down and found out that he was 100% right about it. He grew up in Akron, I think he was born 1923, so he would have been starting, in high school sometime in the late 30s. And he knew very well, even as a young boy, of the reputation of Massillon High School, the team that Paul Brown was still coaching at that time. And he told me he went to a scrimmage that was held between the Massillon High School varsity and the Miami of Ohio varsity football team. And Massillon annihilated Miami of Ohio's team. And now you think about that for a minute. I mean, this is literally men against boys, right? You're talking about high school, 16, 17, maybe a couple of 18-year-olds playing on a football team against players who are 4 years older than they are and who are good enough to be playing college football. Forget about whether Miami is a powerhouse team or not. And Piascik told me that he was there in the stands that day and he saw how they took apart Miami of Ohio's varsity football team. And I think he's speaking to just both what Paul Brown was able to accomplish at all the different levels that he coached at, but also just the kind of talent that was coming out of some of these schools in that area. So that's some of the picture of the beginnings.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry. That's really interesting. I mean, first of all, I guess the Rams sort of made that decision to go to L.A. The idea of having two teams in Cleveland, you wonder how big or significant that market is. I mean, obviously in New York having multiple teams or Chicago having competitive teams, that's understandable. Cleveland, arguably, why not maybe set up shop, say, in Cincinnati, and you can kind of maybe, still go deep into that whole, Ohio cradle of football goodness there, right? But it almost seems that it almost was the gift that was sort of laid upon or on the laps of the Browns that the Rams did move and basically kind of seeded this very rich football market to this brand new team and league.
Yeah, it's very striking that that's the way that happened. I also should say that your characterization of the Rams is not entirely accurate. They were a relatively new franchise. I think they came into the NFL in 1937, so they were actually only in Cleveland for 9 seasons. And until 1945, they really were bottom feeders, and they struggled financially, and they struggled at the gate. One thing that's not commonly known is I think they didn't play a single game in Municipal Stadium. I could be wrong about that, but they until the very final season when they played a kind of famous championship game in December of 1945. But the overwhelming majority of their home games were played at League Park, and they were, certainly prior to 45, not well attended. In fact, I think the Rams were one of the teams that kind of did a combination thing for one season during the war in order to cut back on expenses. Then in 1945, they kind of surprised everybody. The big difference was that was the first season that Bob Waterfield was their quarterback, et cetera, and they were able to go on and win the NFL championship. But yeah, it really did. I mean, what would have happened had they stayed? Who knows? But certainly, yes, it was a big boost to the Browns that all of a sudden now they had not, Cleveland, but basically the region to themselves, the closest team being Pittsburgh. But, there was no team in Cincinnati at that time. There was no team in Indianapolis at that time. And like I said, I mean, I can't really emphasize enough just the presence of Paul Brown as kind of a Ohio icon, even at that point, was really a big deal.
I was going to say, let's talk about Brown and how he puts this sort of this team together, right? Because obviously, without him, well, obviously he's iconic, right? And Hall of Fame on many different levels, right? But I mean, how does he go about putting together this team, and how does he create such an arguably powerhouse so quickly and immediately?
Well, some of it had to do with the fact that a lot of these players, as I mentioned, were available. They were not under contract, even though some of them, by the time you get to 1946, are well past, the normal age that you would be graduating from college. A guy like Max Speedy, for example, a tremendous athlete at the University of Utah, goes immediately into the military in 1942, plays a little bit of service football, I think, but anyway, he's in the service for 4 full years until 1946. Paul Brown coaches, I should add that Brown, after his 3rd season at Ohio State, became a commissioned officer and became the coach of a Navy team at a naval center in Illinois. So he now he's building even more now on who he's seeing play, his evaluation, because now he's playing against military teams from around the country. Otherwise, he would probably have had no idea who a guy like Max Speedy was, coming all the way from Utah. Another guy, Marion Motley, a well-known high school player in Ohio, but also African-American at a time when the NFL had a color line against black players. He was 26 years old in 1946. He had been a collegiate player, and then he had not been eligible to go into the military because of knee problems, but he worked in a steel mill, stuck around Ohio, and Paul Brown remembered him from when he was in high school in Ohio. So he's putting, and then others, a guy like Otto Graham went to Northwestern, so he was playing in the Big Ten at the same time that Brown was coaching Ohio State. He was considered to be an excellent player. He, was drafted in the 1st round by the Lions. Had things gone otherwise, he would have become probably the quarterback of the Lions. Paul Brown saw enough of him to think that he could build a franchise around him, and actually offered him a contract in which Graham would get a monthly check while he was in the service before he did anything for the Browns, along with a bonus, in order to make sure that he got him under contract. And as it turned out, I guess it was a whole nother year that Graham was in the military before the war ended. So he was basically on the Cleveland payroll for a whole year before he ever actually even set foot on a football field. Lots of other guys from the Big Ten. Lou Saban went to Indiana. Other guys from Ohio State who maybe are not now as well known as somebody like Lou Groza. One guy, Lynn Houston, had played at Massillon for Brown, had played at Ohio State for Brown, had graduated by 1946. He ended up playing 8 years as an offensive guard. Kind of an unsung, not really well-known guy, but a solid player who is one of the pieces that you need if you're building a championship team. And there were a couple of instances, a guy named Lou Rimkus, who was an offensive tackle who had graduated from Notre Dame and played 1 year with the Washington Redskins in 1943, I think it was, before he went into the military. Well, he was a smart enough guy that he got wind of the fact that this new league was being formed and that it might drive salaries up. So he ended up somehow getting in contact with the Browns or whatever, and he jumped. He jumped from the NFL to the All-America Conference and became another mainstay. Guy was an All-Pro tackle with the Redskins and continued a couple times as an All-Pro with the Browns. There was also a core of guys, I think it was 5, not really big names, but guys, again, who are the kind of solid grunt players that you need, who had played for the Rams for varying amounts of time, who didn't like the idea of uprooting from Cleveland to move to Los Angeles, not knowing what would happen. Would the team be able to make a go of it? Would they possibly, in the next couple of years, be looking at a franchise that might go under because it didn't work out or whatever? They decided they wanted to stay in Cleveland, and they filed, I guess it was like a collective legal action, that they had signed a contract with the Cleveland Rams and that they were not obligated to play for the Los Angeles Rams. And so those 5 players all ended up being part of the Browns because Paul Brown, being the businessman that he was, made them an offer. We have a new football team right here. You don't have to move anywhere. Sign with us. And they did. So he was really drawing from his collegiate background, history, knowledge of who was around in the Big Ten, players that he coached in Great Lakes Naval Center, opposing players, high school players. I mean, that's how the great story of Marion Motley comes into being. Also, because this was a guy who, had things remained as they were, would never have been offered a chance to play pro football. Paul Brown thought this color line stuff was a lot of junk. So he said, why can't I have a black player? And as it turned out, he got two really good ones right from the very beginning. Bill Willis being another guy who had played at Ohio State, grew up in Ohio. Paul Brown knew very well that he was one of the best players probably in the country. If you're trying to win football games, all of a sudden all this stuff like racial restrictions doesn't really make all that much sense, especially if you're a kind of up-and-coming team in an up-and-coming league that kind of really has to establish itself fast. And I think Paul Brown, clearly he had a conscience enough to say, look, I don't care what anybody says. This is what I'm going to do, and if you don't like it, then I'll go back to Ohio State and coach there. So McBride and the others in the All-America Conference, kind of knowing that this was the key guy in this whole venture, conceded. And also just knowing that these two players, and as it became more as time went on, were going to help his team win a lot of football games, and any of the white players in camp who didn't like it, they could go find something else to do. That was his attitude.
I also want to call out to our audience that Andy's also wrote a book specifically more around the story of how pro football became integrated around this time. It's called Gridiron Gauntlet. We'll make sure we have a link to that book up there as well. But let me ask you also this, though, Andy. How much of it, though, so Brown's clearly, knowledge about the game and the players and the timing of the war and more players being available now, how much of it, though, was, and this is sort of a segue, I think, too, to an important segue or important tangent, was money, right? Because this league, right, with the Don Amicis of the world and these other sort of very well-moneyed owners who really wanted to make a splash and quickly. You could argue there's plenty of talent in Ohio and Brown's got a good pipeline to it, but arguably the NFL, you'd think, would have more kind of an inside track to this, given that they've got a 25 or so year history. I guess my real question is, how much of this also was aided and abetted by, I don't know, I don't want to say it's an unending checkbook, but that of owner Mickey McBride and his willingness perhaps to spend a bit to kind of make his mark from the earliest of moments with this new franchise.
Yeah, that's an essential piece of the story. I think once Brown delivered the goods in terms of being highly successful at the gate and on the field, and as far as I know, being one of the handful, at least in the first couple years of the All-America Conference, one of the few profitable teams in either league, then McBride, it became easier for him to go along with spending the money, outbidding the NFL for players with higher salaries, investing, in amenities that were kind of above and beyond what was normal in pro football at that time for the players. Yeah, so I think what McBride adds to the picture was, yes, a willingness to perhaps sustain some losses early on in the hopes that Brown is really going to produce. And then whether it's fortunate or not, whether it's just a result of all the hard work and knowledge that the collective group of them had, it does become a successful venture. And, McBride now is both vindicated but satisfied that this is going to be a kind of stable investment. And, as with any business, that then leads you to decide that you're willing to invest more or go along with a higher salary for a better player or whatever it might be. Certainly there was risk. I don't have at my fingertips how wealthy McBride was at the point when the league started. there was risk, and a lot of the owners did end up losing a lot of money. Some of them were kind of the one owner of the Chicago franchise named Lindheimer ended up subsidizing some of the owners in order to keep them afloat. They had a franchise in Miami that lasted one season that was a complete disaster and went under. So, and also, as I said, it's also important to note that the NFL, and not just because of the competition, but certainly that was a factor, in the NFL, we're struggling. I mean, the NFL, even as late as this period, is a pretty rocky business venture. I mean, a team like the Steelers, for example, was notorious for just lousy facilities, low salaries, other things along that line. I mean, a lot of it had to do with the fact that some of these teams didn't draw well. But it was, so I think McBride, no question, adds an important piece to the puzzle. And in a different circumstance with a different owner, perhaps the result would have been different. But again, I think a guy like Paul Brown was smart enough to make it clear to McBride what was involved and what he was demanding, both in terms of his own salary, but in terms of, well, this is what it's going to take, both financially and in terms of time and in terms of your commitment to making this a real thing, and got enough of it in terms of a written commitment or whatever that he signed on. And if that had not been the case, if McBride had been hesitant or, indicating that he was going to be trying to cut corners in different places, then I'm sure Brown, knowing what I know about him, would not have gone along and just continued to be the coach of Ohio State, which was a prestigious thing. I mean, there was a lot of controversy that continued for a couple years thereafter. The controversy because clearly, as you mentioned, college football was the thing, much more so than pro football. So for a coach to leave a team that just a few years had been a national champion and which was one of the most prestigious college programs in the country, to go off to this new league of a team that had never even played a single game was a big deal. Now, the other controversy that continued was that Brown offered contracts to a couple more players in the years after 46 to Ohio State guys who had not finished their eligibility. So there was a little bit of a ruckus, alumni, the coach who succeeded him, and just the general Ohio State community was not too happy about all that. But anyway, I think McBride did make a big contribution, and maybe the biggest contribution he made was just to be the money guy and to be smart enough to recognize that Paul Brown knew what he was doing and just to stay the hell out of his way.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, that how much almost implicitly he kind of trusted him. There was one interesting little tidbit that I sort of discovered in my little research as I got ready for this conversation, which was completely new to me, which is this idea and maybe an example of how McBride indeed did sort of a back Brown, but maybe not in an obvious way, was this idea of helping Brown keep who he felt were promising players for whatever reasons, but could not offer them immediately a roster spot. And McBride, through his taxi license ownership part of his enterprises there, basically kept him on the taxi payroll, the taxi cab payroll. And hence the term that we still use today, the taxi squad.
Yeah, that's right.
Pretty interesting stuff.
Presumably they were not driving cabs, but we don't really know. They may have been employed in an office somewhere. I'm not really sure.
Well, look, they also might have been doing publicity, I guess, a bit too, I wonder, because what I really want to sort of get into at this point is the team, not only on the field, was quite something courtesy of Brown's intelligence and approach, but they were a hit on in the stands immediately upon coming to town. And I think it's very interesting considering that the Rams had such a sort of a rocky and tenuous sort of history aside from that last championship as they then absconded to Los Angeles. But, beyond sort of dominating on the field for those 4 years of the AAFC, Cleveland also was quite the sensation in the stands too, right?
Yes, that's right. Now, they did have the advantage of playing in the Municipal Stadium, which, aside from the LA Coliseum, I guess was the biggest venue used by pro football at that point. But yeah, right from the very first game in September of '46 against the team that I mentioned previously from Miami, they were drawing massive crowds. The first year, and then I think the peak was 1947, and it is specific to the Browns because they were ahead of pretty much everybody else. But there was a brief couple years where after the war, there was a big increase in attendance at pro sports as a whole. Also in Cleveland, the Indians set the all-time, at that point, attendance record in 1948. The Browns were especially popular when they were playing in New York against a franchise called the New York Yankees, which was a highly competitive franchise in the All-America Conference. Unfortunately, didn't last really after the merger. But, yeah, and the 49ers, which were also one of the best teams, and which was also establishing sort of a new thing in San Francisco. First of all, there never having been a pro football team anywhere west of Chicago, St. Louis, I guess it was. But also, going into what was largely looked at as Cal Stanford territory, even though neither of those schools is actually in the city of San Francisco, and establishing a pro team that became a hit. And when the Browns came to town, Kezar Stadium was generally full. So yeah, the Browns really made their mark both as a popular team in Cleveland, but also a team that drew lots of crowd in places like New York, San Francisco, and other places. Buffalo also, when they went on the road. Now, that didn't really last, and part of the reason that they didn't last is some of those teams just were not that good. So the popularity in a place like Chicago of the franchise there didn't last. As I mentioned earlier, the franchise in Miami went under after one season. But it wasn't just that those teams weren't necessarily all that good, but it was also just that the Browns were so dominant that people, some portion of them would come out to see this great football team. But in terms of, what was missing often was competitive football. The Browns lost a total of 4 games in 4 years, so that gives you a little bit of a picture. And not all the games were completely one-sided, but the expectation, I think, of fans going to a game to see this big team coming from out of town maybe get their comeuppance by the home squad was kind of missing after a while because it wasn't happening.
So it feels to me like a fundamental question. So explain to me a little bit about, as we sort of kind of round third base here, I guess, on this, where, just how good do you think they were relative to how, say, not so good the rest of the AAFC teams were? Where is the debate sort of lie on that? Because it seems like it's a little of both, but maybe perhaps tilted more towards, and as we get into their absorption into the NFL, maybe it kind of sort of settles the debate that might have been more controversial prior to that then about how good this Browns team was in the AAFC.
Well, to me, it doesn't really make sense to get bogged down in a discussion of which league was better. I don't really see too much of a case that the All-America Conference was better than the NFL. I probably uttered those words myself somewhere along the way, but I can see that maybe the NFL would have a slight edge. I think the bigger thing is how good were the Browns compared to the best teams in the NFL those 4 years. Because it's one thing to say, well, yeah, they won championships against inferior teams, which I don't think is actually 100% true. But I think the bigger question is, were the Browns better than the teams that won the NFL championship during those 4 years? And I think there's a very solid case that the answer is yes. And I actually kind of go into that a little bit one by one in the book. And the biggest thing that I fall back on is that the All-America Conference was tremendously respected in a lot of areas. For example, newspapers and wire services and magazines that picked combined all-pro teams. The All-America Conference was well represented on all of those teams every year for the whole 4 years. It was a smaller league. It had fewer teams, so you wouldn't expect, and there was probably, I'm sure, a little bit of a bias in favor of the NFL because of its longer history, but it's not much below 50% at any point. So people who, in, say, Chicago, were seeing lots of games of both leagues, or New York, where there was 3 teams, actually, at that point, 2 teams in the All-America Conference, plus the Giants. So sports writers in those cities, plus Los Angeles, where there was 1 team from each league, had a chance to see pretty much every player from both leagues, and this is the conclusion that a lot of them were coming to, that the players in this upstart league were good enough in large numbers to be included on these combined all-pro teams. The biggest thing, again, goes back to what we started off with, which was what the Browns did in 1950 and thereafter for the up and through the end of 1955. Dominating. I mean, not just good, not just competitive, but posting a winning percentage that no team in the last 75 years has matched for 6 years. Nobody. Not the Packers with all their championships, not the Steelers, not anybody. 75 years worth of football, the 6-year period of 1950 to 55, the Browns have the highest winning percentage of any team. And as I said earlier, coming into an already existing league and winning a championship, something that nobody else has ever done. And I would say, although they were obviously continuing to add players through the draft, and that they did have a dispersal draft in 1950 when the NFL kind of divided up the players from the All-America Conference from the teams that didn't come into the NFL, but all the teams had equal access to drafting all those players. You know, that's a key story. Well, people say, well, okay, the Browns added Len Ford in 1950, a Hall of Fame defensive end, great player, obviously made them better over the long run. That's true, but it's also true that every single NFL team passed on Ford because the Browns were stuck at the ends of the line when it came to drafting these players, and all the other 12 teams passed. And Paul Brown, having seen Len Ford play, both at Michigan and for the Los Angeles Dons, selected him, and he became a Hall of Famer. I don't know. What are you supposed to say about that? That's not anybody's fault, except the Browns took advantage of a situation where they apparently knew more than anybody else. And the last thing I'll say, I know that we're, as you said, rounding third base. There were 2 things that I wanted to point out that have to do with the whole argument about how, well, you know, now you look at the playoffs and you see these teams and they have to win a minimum of 3 games in the postseason and sometimes 4 if they're a wild card team to win the Super Bowl. Okay, that's true. What's missing from that picture is that in the 12 or 13 league NFL of the 1950s, you either finished first in your conference or you were done. So you had no second chance to make the postseason. Either you maintained long-term regular season excellence enough so that nobody finished ahead of you, or you went out to play golf in December when the season ended. So you have all kinds of teams. The Chicago Bears in 1948 finished 10-2, done, because somebody finished with a better record than they did. The 49ers in 1953 finished 9-3, done, because the Lions had a better record than they did. The great Lombardi era, 1963, the Packers, 11-2-1, finished second by a half a game to the Bears. Done. No second chance, no wild card, no let's broaden the field and bring in these very good teams that maybe are deserving, but they weren't good enough to finish first. The Browns had to finish first place in their conference every year just to make it to the championship game, and they didn't miss until 1956. So I think, when you look at the modern era, whether you're talking about the Patriots, whether you're talking about the Steelers of the 70s, whether the Joe Montana era of the 49ers. Now, obviously, the league has gotten much bigger, so there are more teams, but every single one of those teams finished not with the best record in their conference at least once when they won the Super Bowl. So obviously, you have a bigger league with more teams. You need to add more slots, either by making the division smaller or whatever. I get all that. I'm not arguing against that. I'm simply pointing out that, especially when you have a 12-game season, if your quarterback is hurt in the middle of the season and misses 3 games, and maybe you lose 2 of those games in a 12-game season where you have to finish first, the likelihood is that you're done. And that actually happened. Paul, Otto Graham missed a couple of games somewhere along the way due to injury or parts of games. Other key players injured, whatever, or just the natural, thing that every great team loses at least once or twice during a regular season. You just don't have a situation like you had the year when the Giants finished 9-7, were like 6th in seeded in the NFC. And then, we got hot in January and we won the Super Bowl. That's a completely different animal. Never would have happened anything like that in 1950s. The other thing I'll mention, and I'm sorry I'm going on so long about this.
No, this is absolutely terrific. And I've got one more question after you're done with that. Go ahead.
It makes complete sense, right? Looking at it from 2019, that you seed the playoff teams based on what the best record is. So the team with the best record is the highest seed and gets to play all the games at home as long as they survive, on down to the number 6 seed who never gets to play at home and has to go on the road to win all their games. It makes so much sense. Is like, how could you have ever done it otherwise? Well, it was done otherwise. And the Browns had to play multiple championship games on the road against teams that had inferior records to them. It happened in 1951, which is maybe the most dramatic example, because the Rams were 8-4, the Browns were 11-1, and the game was played in Los Angeles. It happened again in 1953, 1955, and if we carry it over into 1957, it happened then too, even though that's sort of outside the parameters of what we're discussing. And keep in mind too, that whole thing about what I said about 1951, think about the difference between playing a game at Christmas time in Cleveland compared to Los Angeles, and what the advantage would be if the team that finished 11-1 got to play at home based on the weather, all that kind of stuff. So, and it so happens that in all of these dynasties that we've talked about, up until the mid-70s, when the seeding process began, take, for example, the Steelers. 1974, the first time they won the Super Bowl. They were the 3rd best record in the AFC. Somehow, they were the one who was, because it was simply done on a rotation basis at that time, they were seeded as the top seed, even though both the Dolphins and the Raiders had better records than they did, and they won their divisions as the Steelers had. Who gets to play the wild card team, which happened to be a very weak team that year, the Bills? The Steelers, at home, of course. Meanwhile, the 2 best teams in the AFC play an epic playoff game in Oakland, the Sea of Hands game, won by the Raiders. And then the Steelers were able to go into Oakland and beat the Raiders for the AFC Championship and go on to win the Super Bowl a couple weeks later, whatever it was. The point simply is that for all the arguments that can be made about how it's more difficult now because you have to win at least 3 games in the postseason. You have to win 4 if you didn't finish in one of the top 2 seeds. and it has happened. People don't want to hear that there were other things that kind of worked against the Browns. And keep in mind that in 1951, the example that I mentioned, they ended up losing the game in Los Angeles against the Rams. 1953, they had a better record than the Lions did in the regular season. They had to go to Detroit and play the championship game in Detroit, and they lost on a last-minute touchdown. So do I say automatically the result would have been reversed if those games had been played in Cleveland? No. But common sense dictates you that every single fan or player or coach who's ever had anything to do with football would rather play in their home stadium than on the road in a game of that magnitude. So I think these are a couple of things that get lost when I hear all this stuff about, the Patriots, all of which, a great, great run, tremendous run, almost, there are things that we could delve into about that are just unbelievable, off the charts in this era. But there's also things that both worked, I don't want to say against the Browns, but worked. There were things that had to be overcome that were just understood. If you didn't finish first, you didn't mope and complain to the commissioner about how unfair this is. Look, we finished 10-2 and we didn't make it to the playoffs. It was understood. Either you were the best team in your conference or you went home. And the Browns were able to do that, whether you want to extend it to the whole 10-year period of their dynasty, every single season, or even if we just shrink it down to the 6 years of the NFL, they were able to beat out all the competition in their division or conference for 6 straight years, knowing that if they didn't do so, they would be done.
Well, and I think that's sort of a really good place to sort of put a nice exclamation point around it, because look, the transition to the NFL, right? I think, for many of the naysayers of the old AAFC and as Cleveland sort of came into that, right, as sort of all right, well, now let's see you do it, right? I mean, which by the way, seemed to be sort of it continues to sort of be the case with all these challenger leagues even afterwards, like the AFL, right? Those early Super Bowl games between the winners of both of those leagues, right? I mean, until the Jets, literally almost, I think this week, 50 years ago, right? Kind of sort of slayed that dragon with the inferiority complex of the AFL once and for all. I mean, the Browns wasted no time, squashing any semblance of confusion as to whether they were going to be of quality caliber competition for anybody in the NFL.
Well, let me just interrupt, too, because we didn't even mention the fact that in their very first NFL game, they were scheduled against the Eagles, a special arrangement, a Saturday night rather than normal Sunday afternoon. Now, the Eagles had won the 2 previous NFL championships and were widely hailed as one of the greatest teams in NFL history. And so the Browns came into Philadelphia, not in Cleveland. Of course, Bert Bell, the commissioner, made sure the game was played in the Eagles' home stadium.
Yeah, this is September 16th, 1950, for all you aficionados out there. Go ahead.
35-10, final score. The Browns basically took apart this team that right up until the moment that they played them was being hailed as one of the greatest of all time. And it still can be considered that. I mean, the fact that they weren't as good as the Browns in 1950, and I would argue in 1949 or 1948 either, doesn't mean that they weren't a great team. But, as one of the guys said after the game from the Eagles, well, we just played a team from the big leagues, and they took us apart.
And look, I think that's so not only did that sort of, was that sort of a shot across the bow? I mean, that winning the championship their first year, so it's clearly all right. So let me ask you this one question. You've convinced me, and not that I needed convincing, right? But I think this is a very important thing, and I think any sort of old school Cleveland Browns fan, and I'm talking about sort of the natural history of that franchise that I guess arguably or officially sort of resides in Baltimore now, but for whatever. Let me ask you this point of question. I've asked this of a few of our guests when we've branched into the AAFC. At what point, if ever, right? And you're part of the professional researchers group from Pro Football. When and if do you think the AAFC gets its due or official recognition with the NFL, especially in light of the Browns' overall legacy? Or is that just ship sailed and never sort of gets reconciled? Because it feels to me that until and when and unless you get sort of some closure on the contributions of the AAFC generally, despite the relative lopsidedness of the Browns' performance there, I think you can't laud people like Paul Brown and Otto Grant and all the folks involved with the Cleveland Browns franchise of original without sort of clarifying and/or making whole, I guess, the reality that they were part of a challenger league that in many cases could have been argued that was part of their dynasty before they got into the NFL and was frankly a part of that overall story, right? So I guess the question is, that there is one in there. Does the AAF...
The ship has sailed. The ship has sailed.
Okay, so okay. Yeah. But
it's for a very, very tiny group of people who do football research to sort of keep alive, maybe just for the benefit of their own circle and a small number of people just outside of that circle. I remember thinking when Paul Brown died, I think absolutely then it was too late. I don't know how much power he had. You know, he was one owner of dozens. And I think that he continued to try to push that point somewhat. I don't know how late, but certainly by the time he died, which I guess was 1990, there was no way anything was going to change. I think I corresponded with the late Paul Zimmerman a number of times. He was a big advocate of the AAFC. He actually, I think, went so far as to say that the AAFC was better than the NFL. He grew up in New York. He was like a high school, college age guy in the late 40s, so he would go to games, and he eventually became, you know, one of the most influential sports writers. I think while there were people like him and John Stedman in Baltimore and whoever in Cleveland and writers and ex-players you could throw into, now, I mean, there's just so few people with any kind of firsthand observation, and those who are alive probably gave up on it so long ago because, you know, I mean, the NFL just was not going to budge. They felt like they had won the war, which basically they did. And, okay, yeah, we're happy to have this great team come in and contribute to our league, and the other teams that came in contribute to our league, and leave it at that. As far as the legacy, I don't think the powers that be in the NFL wanted anything to do with even just recognizing that the AAFC was a major league, the way it recognizes clearly that the American Football League of the 1960s was. I mean, I don't think even the most diehard AFL partisan would say that the AFL of the early 60s was anywhere near as good as the NFL. But because the AFL hung on and was able to force like a real merger, I mean, what happened in 1950 was more of like what you said, an absorption. With specific terms where every single thing that happened in the AFL is now considered to be NFL history. Everything that George Blanda, for example, did in the 1960s is part of his NFL history book, whatever. There's no asterisk for those 9-10 years that he played saying this was not accomplished in the NFL. It's just completely accepted that everything that happened during those 10 years in the AFL is part of the NFL now. And yet
the dynastic exploits of the Cleveland Browns, especially in the first years of the NFL, could not be rewound from the years prior to that as part of their overall history, huh?
I think that could have been on the agenda maybe for 10, 15, or 20 years after 1950, but as time has gone on, no. I mean, I just don't see the powers that be at this point in the NFL would have absolutely no interest in doing that and would be going out of their way to probably denigrate a rival league from that far back that nobody knows about, that only a couple of teams came out of.
I don't know.
Like I said,
maybe it's naive on my part, right? But when last I checked, it is the Pro Football Hall of Fame, not the NFL Hall of Fame, right? But obviously there's a lot of overhang, and look, I mentioned it very early in our conversation, right? This is not just endemic to that of the NFL and pro football, but many major league sports and their embrace or selective forgetfulness, I guess, on various parts of history. Again, it just seems to me that with such an iconic franchise, with so chock full of memorable and Hall of Fame players and administrators and coaches, and a team that is just such a giant legacy as part of this fabric of the NFL, to not think that, I don't know, it kind of belies logic to me to not at least admit or understand that they had a bit of a history and significant before officially becoming part of the NFL.
Well, the other thing, too, is probably unfortunate circumstances in a lot of ways was Paul Brown's termination from the Browns makes a big juncture there. I mean, if he had continued to be associated in some way with the Browns after 1963, forget about even right up until he died, but say for another 10, 15, 20 years, maybe he would have been someone who would have kept fighting more along that line. Once he got fired, I think maybe he had a little bit less motivation to do that. And it's interesting that you mentioned the Hall of Fame, because technically the Hall of Fame is a little bit of a separate entity from the NFL, but clearly they sort of are on board with what we're talking about here, because you take a guy like Marion Motley, right? I mentioned that he started his pro career when he was somewhat of an advanced age, 26, which is old for a running back. So basically he has about 6 good seasons, 4 in the All-America Conference, and then he wins the rushing title in 1950 and then has a little bit more success after that, by which point he's in his 30s and he's declining and he's got bad knees already before he even started playing pro football. He was one, I don't think it was it was like the 5th class of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and he was elected along with all kinds of other guys who were widely considered to be slam dunks. So I think people who are sort of evaluating the individual player greatness of some of these guys recognized that, both in terms of the fact that these players and this team were able to continue to be great starting in 1950 and afterwards, is an argument in favor of what they had done before. Same thing with people like Dante Lavelli. He plays a little bit longer than Motley, but it's the same thing. He put up great numbers in both leagues, and it was accepted that, how can you say that he was not as good before 1950 as he was after? Otto Graham, a little bit of the same, although he was just so off the charts in the 50s that I think there was no way that anybody could have said, no, he doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame. And we could look at other players too along that line, but I think the point simply is that when you get a little bit of separation from the official NFL point of view, another example would be the all-decade teams that were selected in the 1940s and 1950s. You see a whole host of players from the All-America Conference being picked. I don't remember exactly who the official body was that was picking these teams, but like I said, the perception at the time was much different than it became even just 20 years later, and certainly as we today, or even 30, 40 years after the fact, because you had a lot more people who had firsthand experience seeing the games and the players, and also you had players who were kind of keeping the memory alive a little bit too. Even just I mean, not visibly in terms of any kind of campaigning, but how could you interview somebody who played against Marion Motley and say that he, this is a guy who, when he walked on the field, considering all of his skills, was maybe the best guy on the field out of 66 or 80 players or whatever it was. As soon as he walked on and put a uniform on whichever team he was playing for, that team had a distinct advantage. How could you argue that he piled up these numbers against inadequate competition when he did the same thing thereafter in 1950? So, anyway.
Yeah, this is. Look, I appreciate this. This is a really a good and solid conversation about a team that is, I think, undeniably part of the fabric of the NFL, and is also part of some of the challenges, right? And we've talked extensively on this show about lots of different sort of challenger leagues. I think football uniquely has been, and now with two more leagues coming up, right? One in February with the Alliance of American Football, and then the reboot of the XFL next year, right? I mean, see, it's an interesting sport, this professional football, despite all of its problems and issues, and maybe even medical challenges, that are sort of coming to light. There doesn't seem to be any shortage of people that want to sort of step up and take a crack at the NFL and either change it or evolve it, or perhaps even alternatively play it. And this is, to me, almost as part of the fabric of pro football, this specific story about the Browns, as it is sort of a bigger conversation about the sport and how it gets challenged in the years past and years to come.
That's well said. I think all that is going to happen without any kind of place for the All-America Conference in the discussion, I'm sorry to say. It used to be a big deal to me. I mean, I think there was a senator in Ohio, Sherrod Brown. Does that sound right?
I think that's right, sure.
The year that the Patriots went through the season undefeated, 2007, I guess it was. And as happens every year, whenever somebody gets to 10-0 or whatever, they begin talking about the 72 Dolphins. Well, this guy wanted recognition that the 1948 Browns had also gone 14-0 and won their championship, and that the field should be expanded to two teams that went start to finish perfect, no ties, no losses, nothing. As far as I know, it never got anywhere. Certainly the NFL was not going to include the Browns into any kind of discussion about that with the Dolphins. So that was the last moment when I saw this kind of thing anywhere visibly, and that's 11 years ago. So it's sort of like a lot of things. Maybe this is a way to sort of, among a small circle of people, keep more attention on it than it would otherwise get.
All right, there you have it. And it is a compelling argument that Andy brings up, and about the Cleveland Browns' role and position in football, pro football, NFL history, its place as a team, dynastic as it might be, the players that were part of it, the administrators, the coach, certainly Paul Brown, etc. Is very difficult to ignore the first few years of their existence, the dominance of such in the AAFC, and the contribution that had to what ultimately became a dynastic representation in the early years in their time in the NFL as well. And, it is, perhaps this is a little nook or cranny in the sort of forgotten wings of pro football sports history. But, this is partially why we do this show. We try to call out some of these issues, and we try not to forget them. And frankly, we're trying to bring them front and center to some new generations of fans that, for whatever reason, just don't know about these little stories, these little anecdotes, these little parts of the historical narrative that, I don't think should be forgotten. Certainly shouldn't be swept away, and they need to be sort of grappled with and understood, and maybe sort of come to some kind of conclusion. And this is hardly a crusade, but look, the idea of just simply negating the first 4 years of the Cleveland Browns history, which is kind of what you do when you forget or choose not to officially commemorate or remember, or at least put into the record books, the All-America Football Conference of the late 1940s. Excuse me. I think it's just it belies the total story of history of pro football in this country when you simply ignore or forget it. And obviously, as we've talked about in our conversations, not only that, but a bunch of other places where the challenges, shall we say, to the NFL have been real, have been substantiated, and for whatever reasons brushed away as well. So, let's talk about it. And one way to show more interest in this topic and this story is to buy a copy of Andy's book. It's called The Best Show in Football, the 1946 to 1955 Cleveland Browns. It is published by Taylor Trade Press, and you will find a link to it as well as Andy's other books that we mentioned before as well, including the very relevant Gridiron Gauntlet, the story of the men who integrated pro football, also published by Taylor Trade Publishing. You'll find a link to those books as well as Andy's novel that he wrote on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up episode 97. Can you believe that? Just search up that episode with Andy and you will find convenient links to both or all three of those books from that website. And by all means, do so there, because you'll give us a couple of nickels, a couple of dimes for our value, I guess, in the process, and help keep our lights on and the heat going in the cold winter months as we try to continue to give you all these great shows and episodes and stories about what used to be in professional sports. And we appreciate you doing that. I'm sure Andy will too. And we also appreciate you checking us out, not only on the website, but also our social media feeds. Follow us early and often, if you will. On Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. On Facebook, there's a page devoted to us there. You can send us email either through a link through the website or just send it to us directly, by all means. That's hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And please, 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 if there's anything you could ever do for this show, if it's not patronizing some of our sponsors, if it's not buying some of the books, if it's not just listening religiously each week, as more and more of you are doing, please, by all means, rate and review this silly little show, will you? Give it some pretty decent ratings, too. Explain why you like the show, hopefully. That's on Apple Podcasts or Apple iTunes, or frankly, wherever you can rate and review the show, wherever you listen. We appreciate to no end some rankings of such to help get the algorithm up and going and recommend it to other people like you who might similarly enjoy this show. That is probably the best and least expensive thing you can do to help us support the show. And we appreciate that amazingly and to no end. And we thank you for doing so. And we also thank our friend Jerry Payne for doing so. That is putting our collective pieces together this week and every week. And he and his friends at Podfly Productions are responsible for doing that. And if you need some podcasting support as you're contemplating or looking to take to the next level your own podcast efforts, by all means, check them out. Podfly Productions. You can find them at podfly.net. All right, my thank you, of course, thank you to all, he stumbles his way into saying, for listening to our little show, and we appreciate all of your commentary. We look forward to seeing you again next week, and until then, we wish you nothing but safety and happiness and Godspeed. Until then, we'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.